Hello, Internet. Welcome to Deleted Scenes. You'll notice we're back to using the normal Facebook program, so hopefully the resolution's a little bit better. Still going to continue playing around with different software to do this broadcast. Today I am, in our sermon series we've been talking about Ephesians, and the sermon series is focused on unity, and the deleted scenes have focused on spiritual warfare, except that yesterday's sermon brought those two together, because in chapter 3 of Ephesians, the spiritual warfare aspect really comes to the foreground, and I don't think you can get through Ephesians 3 without focusing on, or you can't get through what Ephesians 3 says about unity without looking at what it says about spiritual warfare. So the sermon was about spiritual warfare. So the question then is, if we talk about spiritual warfare in the sermon, what am I going to talk about here? Because I didn't actually really leave anything on the cutting room floor about spiritual warfare. What I want to do today is I want to just kind of push a little bit further with this idea that has really been coming into my mind about understanding spiritual warfare in a more biblical way. I talked about this when I preached on Jesus's exorcisms in January, that the way we normally talk about spiritual warfare makes me feel uncomfortable. That so much of what we see in Christian pop culture and in secular pop culture about demons and angels and spiritual warfare, I don't see it in the Bible. And that's the thing that really I struggle with, is that I don't see an angel and a demon on opposing shoulders arguing about whether I should shoplift or not. I just don't see that. And so much of what we talk about and what people find in the Bible or say is the biblical view of spiritual warfare, I just don't find. And so I've always struggled with that. And as we've been reading through Ephesians, and as I've been doing other studies, I have started to see a different vision of what the Bible, and specifically what Paul means. I'm going to argue Paul, and at least Paul and John, what they mean when they talk about spiritual warfare. I've been doing some reading. I got a couple of books. This one is the one currently blowing my mind. Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology. It's by John H. Walton, and J. Harvey Walton is his son. Fascinating book, really great for busting categories, changing the way you think. Another book that I got that I'm planning to read, I have not yet, is called Naming the Powers. I've had this recommended to me a few different times. But what I want to focus on today is Ephesians, and the book we've been studying through. And what I want to do is I want to think through the way we talk about spiritual warfare and compare it to what Paul has been saying. So I jotted down a couple of things that seem to define the way we, in my experience, the way most Christians talk about spiritual warfare. And first of all, this comes from Milton, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. It comes from Christopher Marlowe, who wrote Dr. Faustus. It comes from C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Screwtape Letters. I mean, all kinds of people. It's just this story that we're ingrained with, that Satan is, and the demons who serve him are in the process of trying to overthrow God. That their mission is to remove God from the throne and put Satan on it instead. And we get that from a few different things. Mainly, the main place that people turn to is a passage in Isaiah and a passage in Ezekiel that seem to describe Satan as trying to take the throne of God. And we've talked about this. There was we've done last season, we did a deleted scenes about what we do and don't know about Satan. And frankly, at this point, I do not believe that story is true. I don't find it in the Bible. There is no credible place in the Bible where Satan or demons are described as trying to overthrow God. But that does tend to be the way we think of it, that they are opposing God in his heavenly, eternal, spiritual goals. And so that means that when we think of what demons are doing in the world, we think that demons are trying to stop God's spiritual goals. And so the goal of demons and the goal of the evil powers is to steal our souls, to corrupt us and to keep us from going to heaven. They want us to go to hell. They want to oppose all the things that God is trying to accomplish in eternity. So all of their goals are otherworldly. That's what demons are really trying to accomplish. The second thing that we tend to agree on, or that we tend to say about demons, is that we focus on their fighting on an individual level. Guardian angels, personal demons, in the screw tape letters, the whole point of the screw tape letters is there is a particular demon who is responsible for corrupting a particular person. And again, his whole goal is to get that person to go to hell rather than heaven. And so the idea, we think of spiritual warfare as demons trying to attack me personally and to attack my spiritual life, so that their goal is for me to, we'll talk about Satan's really opposing me doing this thing. And we tend to think of demonic powers as intervening in our individual lives and our individual walks, and so that we will be unhappy, or so that we will think badly of ourselves, or so that different things like that. It's very individualized, that Satan takes on humanity one at a time. And I think the most obvious place where we see that is people always assume that they are getting attacked by Satan. There's nothing in the Bible that tells us that Satan is imagined as omnipresent. Satan is not a god. He is not God. So there's no sense in the Bible that Satan could attack every person individually, and yet we still think I rank high enough on Satan's priority list that he's attacking me personally. It's because that's the way we think of it. We think that Satan and God are in a battle for my personal soul. The result of these elements is to say that the idea that we get of demons is of this malicious, cartoonish evil. Think about the word. What does the word demonic bring to your mind? It brings to mind, cruelty and torture and just the worst kind of corruption, reveling in all that is evil, like knowing good and knowing evil and choosing evil and wanting everything to be horrible. That's how when we use the word demonic, and we use the word demonic because that's the way we think of demons, that they're in rebellion against God and they want to overthrow him and replace all good things with all bad things. And it ends up being this really cartoonish type of evil. I have a hard time describing, because it's not something that we encounter very often in real people. We don't, and I say very often, I'm not saying that we never do, but most of the time when we encounter evil in people, it looks different. They think that they're doing the right thing, or they, we're very good at choosing bad things for what we think are good reasons, but being demonic means choosing bad things for bad reasons. And that's what we think of demonic as. And so the result is this spiritual warfare. We're fighting against this rebellion of all that is evil and dark and malicious and cruel against God, and it's all being fought over my soul. And there are a lot of elements in that I struggle to find in Scripture, and that I struggle to find in real life. But when I look at Paul's letter to the Ephesians, I see something different. Paul talks about spiritual warfare differently. Now, there's one part of Ephesians that people use for this view of Ephesians, and that's Ephesians chapter 6, the armor of God. And ultimately, that's where all of this talk, this whole series, the sermon series and the video series is headed, is Ephesians 6 and the armor of God. But the armor, what we end up doing is we bring our own ideas of spiritual warfare into the armor of God. So we define the battle, and then when we read about the armor of God, we think of using those weapons to fight the battle we've already got in our heads. And so we think that God gives us the armor of God in order to fight the demon on my shoulder who wants me to shoplift. And I think in order to understand Ephesians chapter 6, we have to look at what has been said about spiritual warfare the entire time. First of all, Paul doesn't talk about demons. He talks about powers and authorities. And we don't often talk about spiritual warfare in terms of the powers and authorities. But there's a reason why Paul describes them as powers and authorities, because in his perspective and in the ancient Christian Jewish perspective, where they saw evil power at work was not in a little guy on my shoulder, but in the institutions around them, the nations and the religions around them. And so he's talking about powers and authorities because he believes that there are powers and authorities in the world. That is the most important thing about them, that they are powers and authorities. They have power and they have authority, and they are using that power and authority to the detriment of humanity. He's not talking about the tempters and the seducers who whisper in my ear and convince me to do bad things. He's talking about the powers and authorities that have the ability to affect things on a large scale. And those powers and authorities, they aren't fighting a battle for souls. Their goals are not heaven-minded. Right? The powers and authorities of this world, they're focused on this world. They want power here. They want control here. And so for Paul, the powers and authorities, he talks about them being in the heavenly places, but he also says that Christians are in the heavenly places. We talked about that last week. But what he's describing in these spiritual authorities, these powers and authorities, they have power and authority here. Their goals are very this worldly. And their goals are in their names. They want to have power and authority. They want to have more power and more authority. So we saw this in Psalm 82, that they are misusing authority over others, and that the result is not so much the loss of souls or people going to hell, but it's oppression and injustice and destruction. So rather than this being an otherworldly rebellion against God's authority and God's place in heaven or God's heavenly throne, what he seems to be describing is powers and authorities that are in rebellion against God, but not to try and overthrow him. That's an absurd notion. That if there's one God, you can't overthrow him. It seems to be that they want to establish their own dominions here. It's very this worldly, which we see all the time, don't we? I mean, we see this all the time, that there are forces in this world that are battling for power here and domination here. That's a daily occurrence for all of human history. The second thing that we notice about powers and authorities is that they fight on, rather than fighting on the individual level for my soul, like I am not that big of a deal to any of the powers and authorities in the world. The United States of America is one of those. Have you noticed there are people who get really paranoid about being watched and being they're losing their privacy, but there's nothing really that remarkable about them in terms of making them relevant. Like I'm not that worried about being spied on, because I don't think there's anything at stake for anyone else. Like the government doesn't care that much to devote a spy to looking after me. Now the government cares very much about the social order that I'm a part of, and I am affected every day by what the government is doing. But for the powers and authorities, it seems to me that their goal is not individual corruption, but their goal is oppression and control. That's what they're trying to accomplish. It's nothing that complicated or secretive. It is what they are. All of this is in their name, the powers and authorities. And so what that means is, rather than seeing evil as, like, we call things demonic when they're cartoony and crazy and completely unrelatable. But if the powers that God is opposing, that God is conquered, facing down in Ephesians, are the powers and authorities of this world, which according to Paul and the Psalms and all these other places, that is an overlap of human authorities and spiritual authorities. If that's the enemy that God is taking on, then demonic is not just like sacrificing children and doing all these horrible things. It's much more common. If you want to talk about demonic, the best example people, or the most common example people often give is Hitler. And Hitler did demonic things. And there is this shocking level of evil that we find in the Nazi regime. But if we're looking at the powers and authorities, then demonic is much more common. For instance, Stalin would be more demonic than Hitler in the sense that he killed more people. Mao Zedong, more demonic, killed more people, oppressed more people. They did it for longer. We see oppression all over the world in all kinds of places. Yeah, Heather, exactly. Like when we see powers in this world that are forcing powers in this world that are compelling people and creating evil that wouldn't necessarily exist otherwise. But it happens all around us. For instance, if we want to look at our own history, I think it's very easy to identify demonic influence in American history. I would say of the powers and authorities, the most obvious example in our history would be slavery, which is an example of the powers of this world oppressing another people group, exploiting another people group. No, that's okay. Don't worry. But we don't typically talk about things like slavery as demonic, or our treatment of Native Americans. I mean, you can look at any country and look at the way they have used power in their history and the way they have treated other people, and you'll find the powers and authorities at work. And this is something that is so common in our world. And it's to me, that's much more relevant. What Paul is talking about here is much more relevant than speculating about the invisible beings that might be on my shoulder. And now I'm not saying that we don't feel the influence of spiritual beings in our lives, that we aren't attacked by darkness. I don't want to invalidate people's experiences of spiritual warfare in their individual lives. But what I'm saying is the Bible talks a lot more about this social, political level of spiritual warfare, and we don't talk about it at all. When the Bible wants to talk about spiritual warfare, it talks about this big level stuff. We never talk about it. But let me give you another big example. If you want to see what this kind of spiritual warfare, what it looks like, look at the book of Revelation. Because you open Revelation to chapter 12 and 13, and you get this story of a dragon. And the dragon, here's an interesting thing, and this is something I've learned since the last time I did a broadcast on Satan. It says in Revelation 12, it calls the dragon Satan, that ancient serpent, and we always assume that the ancient serpent refers to the snake in Genesis chapter 3, and so we assume that Satan is the snake from Genesis chapter 3. He's not. There's no evidence to suggest that he is, that Satan was in the Garden of Eden. In fact, that reference to a serpent is actually referring to a creature called the Leviathan. You can see this in Isaiah 27. The language, that's why it's a dragon. Notice that at the end of Genesis 3, God curses the snake, and the snake diminishes, and yet in Revelation, he's become a dragon. So God's curse didn't have an effect, it would seem. But rather, he's actually talking about a creature called a Leviathan that is a chaos monster, and much more accurately describes the sense of the powers and authorities behind people. But anyway, so you have the dragon, and the dragon tries to stop the Messiah. When he fails, he goes to the sea, and he calls this beast out of the sea. And this beast comes out of the sea, and it's described with all this crazy Revelation-style imagery. But the imagery makes it very obvious that the beast is an image for Rome, for the government of Rome. And then there is another beast that comes out of the earth, and the imagery there makes it clear that the second beast is describing Roman religion. And so the idea here is that there is this spiritual evil that is using a government and the religious system of that government to oppose God's people. And there isn't a sense that there's never a sense that he's trying to, well, okay, depends on how you read the war in heaven bit. It doesn't really seem to be a battle for the cosmos. It seems to be a battle for the earth. And that's the picture of exactly the same kind of spiritual warfare that we see in Ephesians, is this idea of spiritual evil and human institutional evil working together and trying to dominate other people. That's what the beasts try to do, is they try to control humanity. They try to control people. And that brings me to one more interesting thought. I want you to think about this. If we're talking about powers and authorities, as you know, if we're talking about the forces that oppose God as these powers and authorities rather than demons, then what does demon worship look like? Or satanic worship? Because we tend to think of that as things like pentagrams and goats' heads, and again, that demonic behavior. But we see people worshiping the beasts. They worship in Revelation chapter 13, which means they're worshiping this order, this government, this power. In that case, and I'm working these ideas through, and I'm trying to see where I land, and I'm inviting you into a conversation about this. In that case, then isn't demon worship, doesn't it actually tend to look more like worshiping power, worshiping authorities, worshiping our governments, worshiping our factions, worshiping conquest over other people? And don't we see that so often? Again, think of the obvious example would be the Nazi regime, and you see people worshiping this faction they've created and worshiping the power it gives them. And you see the same thing when people gather together to support. We see this in America when people get really passionate about their political leader, whatever candidate or whatever cause they have, they will get super passionate about this particular cause. And we see that in history so often as a starting point for profound evil, when people begin to worship this power structure or worship this faction that they're a part of. It's amazing how often we see this kind of thing. But we don't think about it in those terms as Christians. And here's where I want to land the plane. If you've gone with me this far, here's what you may be worried of where I'm going with this, because what I don't want to do is I don't want to end up with the social gospel and just say, oh, well, so what we need to do is we need to get involved in politics and fight these political issues on a political level. There are things that we need to oppose evil, and we need to seek justice. But I don't want to say that spiritual warfare, I don't want to say it doesn't take place on the spiritual realm. It takes place in the ballot box, or we need to fight for justice, and we need to fight for what is good. But what I think we need to understand is that the gospel is meant to be the answer, the ultimate answer to these issues. See, what happens in the church is conservatives tend to want to focus on individual salvation and the gospel, but not social issues. And on the liberal end, when you go too far that way, you end up focusing on social issues and not talking about salvation. And what we need to understand is that we are supposed to be focusing on social issues. We are supposed to be focusing on the conditions of the world, on the powers of the world, on all of these things. We need to care about oppression. We need to care deeply about what's happening to people in the world. But the whole point of the New Testament is to tell us that the ultimate solution to all of that is Jesus Christ. It is uniting the world under Christ. It is giving our allegiance to Jesus rather than to these other powers. The gospel is meant to be an answer to this worldly problems. So often we treat the gospel as an answer just to my eternal destiny. It's my fire insurance, but these problems that I'm facing today, I have to find practical answers to. But Scripture is teaching us that the gospel and the church are meant to be God's ultimate answers to these problems, and that we won't find a solution without Jesus. We won't find a solution without giving him our allegiance and doing things his way. And so I think that it's important for us when we talk about spiritual warfare to understand this big cosmic level on which it's happening, and to understand that we see spiritual warfare happening in slavery, in human trafficking, in poverty, in hunger, in all kinds of things happening around the world, and we need to address those. We need to confront those. We confront them by feeding the poor, by freeing the prisoners, by healing the sick, and by bringing the gospel. And so what we need to do is we need to take all of the secular or practical issues and the spiritual solutions, and we need to bring them together. Hopefully that's what I've been thinking through. That's what's been stuck in my head, and what I want to continue to work through is this idea of spiritual warfare being very practical, and social justice and social activism being very spiritual. So I'm going to continue to think that through. Feel free to comment on here or engage in conversation. I love to keep chewing on this and hear what other people think, because this is just what I've been wrestling with as I've been reading. So that's what I've got for today. If you're local, we'd love to see you at church on Sunday. And either way, we'd love to have you tune in again next week, Monday at 3, when we do another live broadcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. God bless.